January 7, 1988, 3,234 meters above sea level. The Hindu Kush Mountains do not forgive, and today they are screaming. A biting wind tears across the jagged limestone of Hill 3,234, carrying the scent of dry pine and incoming snow. On this ridge, 39 young men of the Soviet Ninth Company crouch in shallow pits scraped into the frozen rock. Their hands are cracked from the cold, their lungs burning in the thin, oxygen-starved air. Below them, the shadows of the Loya Paksha province are moving. At exactly 15:30, the silence of the clouds is shattered. A rocket-propelled grenade streaks through the gray sky, slamming into the perimeter. It is followed by the rhythmic, heavy thud of recoilless rifles. The Ninth Company was sent here to watch a road, but as the first wave of dark figures emerges from the tree line, they realize they have been sent to hold a graveyard. There is no retreat down the sheer cliffs behind them. There is only the rock, the cold, and the certainty that by dawn the ridge will be silent once again. The winter of 1987 into 1988 marked the twilight of the Soviet-Afghan War, a conflict that had ground into a brutal 9-year stalemate. The Soviet 40th Army was no longer fighting for territory, it was fighting for a graceful exit. However, the Mujahideen forces, emboldened by American-made Stinger missiles and shifting global politics, were tightening their grip on the vital supply lines. Nowhere was this more critical than the road from Gardez to Khost. The city of Khost had been cut off for months, its civilian population and military garrisons starving under a total blockade. If the Soviet Union were to leave Afghanistan with any semblance of dignity, they first had to break this siege. This necessity gave birth to Operation Magistral, one of the largest and most complex military maneuvers of the entire war. The operation required the Soviet forces to secure the high ground overlooking the highway. In the thin air of the Hindu Kush, the war was won or lost on the peaks. The Mujahideen had spent years turning these mountains into a vertical fortress, honeycombed with caves and heavy machine gun nests. To clear the way for the massive supply convoys, the Soviet High Command deployed their elite, the VDV, Vozdeshno-Desantny Vojska, or airborne forces. These were the blue-barated paratroopers, the winged infantry trained for the most hazardous assignments. Among them was the 345th Independent Guards Airborne Regiment, a unit that had been in Afghanistan since the very beginning, serving as the fire brigade sent to douse the most dangerous insurgent flare-ups. As Operation Magistral commenced in late December 1987, the Ninth Company was tasked with occupying a specific nameless height, Hill 3,234. Its position was tactically indispensable. From this vantage point, a small unit could observe miles of the valley floor and direct devastating artillery fire onto any Mujahideen attempt to ambush the passing convoys. However, the height was also a bullseye. Isolated from the main body of the regiment and perched on a narrow ridge that offered little room for maneuver, the 39 men of the Ninth Company were effectively an island in a sea of hostile territory. They were placed there to be the eyes of the army, but in doing so, they became the ultimate target for an enemy that knew the mountain better than they knew their own homes. By the first week of January 1988, the environmental conditions on Hill 3234 had become as much of an adversary as the Mujahideen. At over 10,000 feet, the paratroopers were living in a landscape of extremes. During the day, the sun reflecting off the limestone was blinding. At night, temperatures plummeted well below freezing, turning the simple act of sleep into a battle against hypothermia. The 39 men of the Ninth Company, led by Senior Lieutenant Sergei Kachev, were not a seasoned veteran force of old men, but a cross-section of Soviet youth conscripts from across the USSR, who had been forged into a cohesive unit by months of high-altitude training. They were equipped with the standard tools of the VDV, AK-74 rifles, RPGs, and the NSV Utes heavy machine gun. Their most powerful weapon, however, was the radio link to the regimental artillery batteries stationed miles away in the valley. The military environment surrounding the hill was reaching a fever pitch. The Mujahideen leaders, including the infamous Jalaluddin Haqqani, understood that if the Soviet convoys reached Khost, the years of struggle to isolate the city would be undone. To prevent this, they assembled a force of elite Black Storks specialized commandos, reportedly trained in Pakistan and often bolstered by foreign fighters. These were not the typical local tribesmen. They were well-equipped, highly motivated, and prepared for a frontal assault on a fortified position. While the Soviet paratroopers dug their foxholes into the stubborn rock, using explosives because the ground was too hard for shovels, the Black Storks were quietly encircling the mountain. The Soviet high command knew the risks. Intelligence reports suggested a massive concentration of enemy forces in the Loya Paksha region, specifically targeting the heights of Operation Magistral. Yet the Ninth Company was ordered to stay. They were the linchpin of the entire blockade-running effort. Survival was not the primary metric of the mission. The metric was time. Every hour the Ninth Company held Hill 3234 was another hour the supply trucks could move toward the starving city below. As the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks on the afternoon of January 7th, the paratroopers finished their final perimeter checks. They were 39 men on a limestone spire, disconnected from the world, waiting for a storm they knew they could not outrun. The struggle for Hill 3234 can be dissected through the tactical angle of mountain defense and the raw human angle of the men occupying the foxholes. Tactically, Hill 3234 was a nightmare to defend. Instead, they had to string their defenses along a rocky spine. If the enemy breached any single point, they could effectively split the company in half. Furthermore, the rocky terrain meant that every incoming mortar shell or rocket wouldn't just kill with shrapnel. It would turn the very mountain into a weapon, sending shards of razor-sharp limestone flying through the air like secondary projectiles. The paratroopers were forced to rely on dead space management, identifying the blind spots in the cliffs where the Mujahideen could sneak up and filling those gaps with pre-sighted artillery coordinates. From the human angle, the 39 paratroopers were under immense psychological pressure. They were young men, mostly in their early 20s, facing an enemy that had declared a jihad against them. There was no behind the lines at Hill 3234. Every man, from the cooks to the radio operators, was a front-line combatant. The cold was a constant, gnawing presence that slowed their reflexes and numbed their fingers. Despite this, the camaraderie of the VD, the Brotherhood of the Blue Beret, acted as a powerful emotional anchor. They weren't fighting for the Soviet Union's geopolitical interests in the Hindu Kush. They were fighting for the man in the foxhole 3 meters to their left. This bond was the only thing preventing a total collapse of morale when the first waves of Black Storks began to scale the sheer cliffs under the cover of darkness. The complexity of the battle is further deepened when examining the enemy angle and the technological angle. The Mujahideen Black Storks represented a significant departure from the usual guerrilla tactics encountered in Afghanistan. Typically, the insurgents favored hit-and-run ambush, but at Hill 3234, they adopted the tactics of a professional assault force. They utilized coordinated fire and movement. This enemy angle revealed a high degree of confidence and external support. The Mujahideen weren't just trying to harass the paratroopers, they were attempting to physically overrun the peak and execute every survivor to send a message to the withdrawing Soviet forces. The technological angle highlights the paradox of 1980s warfare. While the paratroopers were using centuries-old tactics of high-ground defense, their survival depended entirely on a fragile umbilical cord of radio waves. Because the Ninth Company was so heavily outnumbered, their small arms fire was merely a holding action. Their true primary weapon was the 122 mm D3 howitzer batteries located at the regimental base. The radio operator, Senior Sergeant Ivan Babenko, became the most important man on the hill. He had to relay precise coordinates in the heat of battle, often while shrapnel tore through the air around him. The technology of directed artillery allowed 39 men to project the power of 1,000, provided the radio stayed functional and the artillerymen could maintain their rate of fire without overheating the barrels. The paratroopers had to manage their limited ammunition, averaging about 300 to 400 rounds per man while waiting for the heavy shells to bridge the gap between their position and the encroaching Black Storks. If the radio died, the company died. As the dusk of January 7th turned into a moonless, freezing night, the technical limitations of their equipment were pushed to the breaking point. The batteries in the radios struggled in the sub-zero temperatures, and the barrels of the paratroopers' light machine guns began to glow cherry red from the constant friction of defense. At exactly 15:30, the sky over Hill 3234 erupted. Over 400 mujahedin, led by the elite Black Storks, unleashed a deluge of fire from 3 directions. Rocket-propelled grenades and mortar shells rained down on the narrow ridge, turning the air into a vortex of jagged rock and white-hot metal. The Soviet paratroopers, hunkered down in their shallow limestone pits, couldn't even lift their heads as the shrapnel shredded their supply crates and smashed their water containers. Within the first few minutes, as the dust from the initial bombardment began to settle, they didn't move like untrained guerrillas. They moved in disciplined squads, utilizing the dead space of the cliffs to get within 50 meters of the Soviet lines. The paratroopers realized with sinking hearts that they were facing an enemy that outnumbered them 10-1. Senior Lieutenant Sergei Kachev moved between foxholes, screaming over the din of battle to keep his men focused. "Conserve your fire," he roared. But the mujahedin were relentless. They charged with a ferocity fueled by religious fervor and the knowledge that the paratroopers had nowhere to run. By 16:30, the first casualties began to mount. The platoon medic, moving through a hail of bullets, was working frantically as the limestone ground beneath him turned a dark, frozen crimson. By 19 o'clock hours, the mujahedin had launched 9 separate assaults, each one more desperate than the last. The Black Storks were now so close that the paratroopers could hear their shouts over the wind. Ammunition was reaching a critical low. It was at this moment that the battle reached its most harrowing crescendo. The enemy had managed to crawl within 15 meters of the main Soviet line close enough to begin lobbing grenades into the paratroopers' foxholes. Recognizing that they would be slaughtered if the enemy breached the ridge, the 9th Company called in the regimental artillery to strike their own coordinates. The D-30 howitzers in the valley opened up with a terrifying roar. The shells impacted just meters from the Soviet foxholes, the shock waves nearly rupturing the eardrums of the paratroopers, were decimated by the very steel that was supposed to protect the hill. The wall of fire acted as a physical barrier that the mujahedin simply could not penetrate. The ridge belonged to the living, but the price of the ground was written in the silence of the snow. As the first light of January 8, 1988, touched the peaks of the Hindu Kush, the silence was more jarring than the thunder of the night before. The relief column men of the 345th Reconnaissance Platoon finally reached the summit of Hill 3234. What they found was a scene from a charnel house. The limestone ridge was blackened by soot and littered with the jagged remnants of thousands of shell fragments. Of the 39 men who had stood on that ridge at sunset, 6 were dead. Nearly all of the survivors were wounded, many of them multiple times, their bandages frozen stiff against their skin. The Black Storks had withdrawn under the cover of the morning mist, leaving behind dozens of bodies in the crevices below the Soviet positions. The tactical success was absolute. The 9th Company had held. Because they refused to yield the height, the mujahedin were unable to bring heavy weapons to bear on the highway below. And medicine successfully rolled into the city of Khost, breaking a siege that had lasted for years. For the paratroopers, however, the victory was bitter. They watched as their fallen brothers, including Senior Sergeant Vyacheslav Alexandrov and Corporal Andrei Melnikov, were wrapped in ground cloths to be carried down the mountain. Both men would later be posthumously awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest honor the state could bestow. That was increasingly determined to see the Soviet army leave. The survival of the 9th Company on Hill 3234 became a defining moment in the closing chapter of the Soviet-Afghan War, but its psychological and political impact reached far beyond the mountain pass. Only 1 month after the last shot was fired on the ridge, Mikhail Gorbachev announced the formal timetable for the complete withdrawal of Soviet troops from Afghanistan. The blood spilled on the limestone was, in many ways, the final payment for a war that the Soviet Union was already leaving behind. For the veterans of the 345th Regiment, there was a haunting sense of irony. They had performed the impossible for a cause that was being dismantled by the bureaucrats in Moscow before the wounded had even reached the hospital. As the years passed, the battle underwent a transformation in the public consciousness. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the story of Hill 3234 was initially buried in the general desire to forget the Afghan trauma. Unlike the political disaster of the war itself, the conduct of the Ninth Company was viewed as untarnished. They became the Russian Thermopylae, a small band of brothers who stood their ground against overwhelming odds. The event was immortalized in Russian popular culture, most notably in the 2005 film The Ninth Company, which, while dramatized, cemented the unit's place in the pantheon of military legend. The verifiable reports from the engagement also provided a chilling look at the changing face of global conflict. Internationally backed Special Forces wing of the Mujahideen. The defense of Hill 3234 proved that even with the most advanced artillery support and elite training, the nature of high-altitude mountain warfare remains a brutal, primal contest of wills. To this day, the 345th Independent Guards Airborne Regiment remains one of the most decorated units in Soviet and Russian history, largely due to those few hours on a nameless peak where survival was never the expectation, only the mission mattered. The ridge at Hill 3234 stands today as a silent monument to a paradox of the human condition, the capacity for absolute devotion to a cause that is already lost. When we examine the defense of the Ninth Company, we are not just looking at a successful military operation. We are looking at the final, desperate heartbeat of an empire. These 39 men were asked to hold a limestone spire in a land that had spent centuries devouring invaders, and they did so with a ferocity that defied biological limits. They fought for a road they would never drive on and for a city they would never enter, fueled only by the horizontal loyalty of the men in the foxholes beside them. In the cold vacuum of historical hindsight, Hill 3234 serves as a grounding reminder of the true cost of strategic necessity. While politicians in Moscow and Washington moved pieces across a global chessboard, the reality of that game was written in the frostbitten fingers of teenagers, calling for artillery fire on their own positions. The Black Storks and the Soviet paratroopers were two sides of the same, tragic coin warriors pushed to the limits of human endurance by ideologies that would shift like the mountain winds long after the bodies were buried. Ultimately, the story of the Ninth Company is a testament to the fact that in the most brutal environments imaginable, the human spirit does not break. It hardens. It proves that duty, when stripped of its political veneers, is a raw and terrifying force. As the snow continues to fall on that nameless ridge in the Hindu Kush, the legacy of the 39 remains clear. They were sent where survival was never expected, yet they ensured that their story would outlive the very state they fought to defend. They did not just hold a hill. They occupied a permanent place in the history of human courage, reminding us that even in the face of certain destruction, a man can still choose to stand.